The clock on the Army Reserve Center wall showed 6:45 p.m. when Staff Sergeant David Johnson finally finished his paperwork. It had been one of those long Tuesday evenings where everything seemed to take twice as long as usual. The monthly equipment inventory had dragged on for hours, and now his stomach was growling loud enough that Private Rodriguez at the next desk had started laughing about it. David stretched his arms above his head and looked down at his uniform. The digital camouflage pattern was still crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his name tape sat perfectly straight above his right chest pocket. After 12 years in the Army, with 2 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, keeping his uniform sharp had become second nature. His wife always joked that he looked more put together coming home from reserve duty than most people did going to church. "See you next month, Sergeant," called out Lieutenant Williams from across the room. David waved back, grabbed his keys from his desk drawer, and headed for the door. The evening air hit his face as he stepped outside, carrying the familiar scent of summer in the city. Kids were playing basketball at the court across the street, their laughter echoing off the buildings. His stomach growled again, reminding him that he'd skipped lunch to help train some new recruits on radio procedures. The drive home would take another 20 minutes, and his wife wouldn't have dinner ready until 8. There was a quick-stop convenience store just 2 blocks away that made decent sandwiches. Nothing fancy, but it would tide him over. David climbed into his pickup truck and drove the short distance to the store. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few cars and a delivery truck unloading boxes of chips near the entrance. He found a spot close to the door and shut off the engine. Through the large windows, he could see the store was quiet inside, just the way he liked it. No crowds, no long lines. As he walked toward the entrance, David noticed his reflection in the store window. The uniform still looked good even after a long day. His rank insignia caught the light from the parking lot lamps, the 3 chevrons, and rocker clearly visible on his sleeve. He'd earned every one of those stripes through hard work and dedication, starting as a private fresh out of high school and working his way up through the ranks. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh and cool air rushed out to meet him. The store smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies with a hint of the fried chicken from the hot food section. David nodded to the cashier, a young woman with purple hair who looked up from her phone and smiled. Behind the counter, an older man was restocking cigarettes, moving slowly but methodically. David made his way to the sandwich section, scanning the options behind the glass. Turkey and Swiss looked fresh. So did the Italian sub with extra peppers. His mouth watered as he tried to decide. The turkey would be healthier, but the Italian sub looked like it had more meat. After a moment's consideration, he pointed to the Italian sub. "That one looks good," he told the sandwich maker, a teenage boy with a friendly smile. "Can you heat it up for me?" "Sure thing, sir," the kid replied, pulling on plastic gloves. "Give me just a minute." While he waited, David walked over to the drink coolers and grabbed a bottle of sweet tea. The cold glass felt good in his hand after the warm evening outside. He checked his phone quickly, seeing a text from his wife asking what time he'd be home. He typed back that he was grabbing a quick bite and would be there in about 30 minutes. The sandwich maker called out that his order was ready. David paid with cash, leaving a small tip that made the kid's face light up. Sometimes the smallest gestures made the biggest difference in someone's day. He'd learned that lesson many times during his deployments, where a kind word or small act of generosity could change everything. Walking back toward his truck, David felt good about the day. Training had gone well. The new recruits were eager to learn, and tomorrow was his day off. He planned to sleep in, maybe work on the fence in his backyard that had been nagging at him for weeks. His wife had been patient about it, but he could tell she was ready for him to finish the project. The parking lot seemed quieter now. Most of the other cars were gone, and the delivery truck had finished unloading. David clicked his key fob to unlock his truck, the familiar beep echoing in the evening air. He was almost to the driver's door when he heard the sound of car doors slamming behind him. He turned around to see 2 police officers getting out of a patrol car that had just pulled into the lot. They were both looking directly at him, their expressions serious and focused. David felt a small flutter of confusion in his chest. He hadn't been speeding on the way to the store, and his truck registration was current. Maybe they were just making a routine stop at the convenience store, but something about their body language made him pause. Both officers had their hands resting on their duty belts, not quite touching their weapons but positioned in a way that suggested they were ready to. They were walking toward him with purpose, not the casual stride of cops grabbing coffee or snacks. David stood still beside his truck, the sandwich bag in one hand and his keys in the other. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation without panic. Two officers, both appearing tense, approaching a man in uniform in a well-lit public area. Nothing about this made sense, but David knew better than to make any sudden movements or appear confrontational. The first officer, a stocky man with graying hair and a mustache, spoke first. "Sir, we need to see some identification." David blinked, genuinely confused. "Is there a problem, officers?" "Just need to see your ID," the second officer repeated, younger and taller than his partner. His hand had moved closer to his weapon. David felt his heart rate increase slightly but kept his voice calm and respectful. "Of course, officers. Can I ask what this is about?" The first officer's eyes narrowed. "We'll ask the questions. ID. Now." This wasn't right. David had been stopped by police before, usually for minor traffic violations, and it had never felt like this. The hostility in their voices, the aggressive postures, the way they were treating him like a threat when he was clearly in military uniform, standing next to his own vehicle in a public parking lot. But David also knew that arguing would only make things worse. He'd seen too many situations escalate because someone insisted on knowing why they were being questioned. Right now, the smartest thing to do was comply, get through whatever this was, and go home to his family. "My wallet is in my back pocket," David said slowly, making sure both officers could see his movements. "I'm going to reach for it now." The younger officer tensed visibly as David slowly reached for his wallet, pulling it out with deliberate, careful movements. This was insane. He was a decorated veteran, in full uniform, doing nothing but buying a sandwich. Yet these two officers were treating him like he was some kind of dangerous criminal. As David handed over his military ID and driver's license, he couldn't shake the feeling that this routine Tuesday evening was about to become anything but routine. Officer Bradley Thompson took David's identification cards with barely a glance, his eyes focused more on David's face than the documents in his hands. The military ID was right there, clear as day, with David's photo, rank, and unit information. But Thompson seemed to be looking right through it as if the official government identification meant nothing at all. "What are you doing here?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying an edge that made David's stomach tighten. David gestured toward the convenience store behind him. "Just bought a sandwich, sir, heading home from my reserve duty." The younger officer, whose name tag read Martinez, had moved to David's left side, creating what David recognized as a tactical positioning. They were flanking him now, treating him like a suspect rather than a citizen who had simply shown his identification when asked. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this area," Thompson said, still holding David's IDs but not really looking at them. "Someone matching your description." David felt a chill run down his spine. Suspicious activity? He'd been in the store for maybe 10 minutes, buying a sandwich and making small talk with the workers. The only thing he'd done was exist in this parking lot while wearing his army uniform. "What kind of suspicious activity?" David asked, trying to keep his tone respectful but firm. "I've been here less than 15 minutes. Martinez stepped closer, his hand now resting openly on his service weapon. "We're asking the questions here." The situation was spiraling in a direction that David recognized from his military training, but this wasn't a battlefield overseas. This was a convenience store parking lot in his own hometown, and he was being treated like an enemy combatant. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent years serving his country, protecting the very freedoms that were now being denied to him by these two officers. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "But I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army. I'm in full uniform, I've provided my identification, and I haven't done anything wrong." Thompson's face darkened. I don't care what you're wearing. Anybody can put on a costume. A costume. David felt the word hit him like a physical blow. 12 years of service, 2 deployments, countless hours of training and sacrifice. And this officer was calling his uniform a costume. The patches on his sleeves weren't decorations, they were earned through sweat, blood, and dedication to something bigger than himself. Sir, this isn't a costume, David replied, his military bearing keeping him composed even as anger began to build in his chest. These are my service ribbons, my rank insignia, my unit patch. Everything here is real and earned. But Thompson wasn't listening. He'd already made up his mind about who David was and what he represented. The evidence in front of him, the military ID, the perfectly maintained uniform, David's respectful demeanor, none of it mattered. In Thompson's eyes, David was guilty of something, and the uniform was just an elaborate disguise. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle, Martinez ordered suddenly. David's heart began pounding harder. Wait, what? Why? I've cooperated with everything you've asked. Turn around now, Thompson barked, stepping closer. This was the moment David had hoped would never come. He'd heard stories from other veterans, other men who looked like him, about encounters that started exactly like this. But he'd always told himself that his uniform would protect him, that his service would mean something, that surely no police officer would treat a soldier this way. He was wrong. Officers, please, David said, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. I'm not resisting. I just want to understand what's happening here. You're about to be arrested for obstruction if you don't comply right now, Thompson threatened. David knew he had a choice to make. He could continue trying to reason with these officers, hoping that somehow common sense would prevail. Or he could comply with their unreasonable demands and hope to sort it out later. Neither option felt right, but one was clearly safer than the other. With his military training screaming at him that this was wrong, David slowly turned around and placed his hands on the hood of his truck. The metal was still warm from the engine and he could feel the heat through his palms. Behind him, he heard Martinez talking into his radio, calling for backup units. Backup? For what? David was one man in uniform who had bought a sandwich. What possible threat did they think he posed that required additional officers? The pat-down that followed was more aggressive than necessary. Thompson's hands moved roughly over David's uniform, checking pockets that were clearly empty, searching for weapons that obviously weren't there. It felt like a violation, a deliberate attempt to humiliate him rather than a legitimate security measure. He's clean, Thompson announced, as if he'd expected to find something incriminating. Why are you doing this? David asked, his voice strained with the effort of staying calm. I'm a veteran. I serve this country. I'm wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Yes, and I'm supposed to just believe that? Thompson shot back. You think wearing some military gear makes you special? The words stung more than David expected. Special? No, he didn't think he was special. But he did think that serving his country, taking an oath to defend the Constitution, putting his life on the line for strangers, he thought that meant something. He thought it deserved basic respect, basic human dignity. More sirens were approaching now. David could see the flashing lights reflecting off the store windows, creating a chaotic light show that drew the attention of everyone inside. The cashier, with purple hair, was standing at the window now, her phone in her hand, probably recording what was happening. Other customers had gathered too, their faces pressed against the glass. 3 more patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting everything in alternating red and blue. 6 officers total now for one man buying a sandwich. David felt surrounded, outnumbered, and completely helpless despite having done nothing wrong. Officer Martinez was speaking into his radio again, describing the situation to someone. Yeah, we've got him detained. Black male, approximately 6 feet, military clothing, claims to be Army. Claims to be Army. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His identification was right there in Thompson's hand. His uniform was regulation. His bearing, his speech, his respectful demeanor, everything about him screamed military. But somehow these officers had decided that none of it was real. "Officers," David tried one more time. "Please look at my identification. Call my unit if you need to verify. I'm telling you the truth." Thompson finally looked down at the military ID in his hand, but his expression didn't change. Fake IDs are easy to get these days. David felt something break inside him. Not his composure. His training was too strong for that. But his faith, his belief that doing the right thing mattered, that service meant something, that the uniform he wore with pride would protect him from this kind of treatment. "I need you to put your hands behind your back," Martinez said, pulling out his handcuffs. "For what?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Suspicious activity. Possible impersonation of military personnel. Obstruction of justice." The charges were absurd, made up on the spot to justify what they'd already decided to do. David knew that fighting would only make things worse, that any resistance would be twisted into more charges, more justification for their actions. As the cold metal clicked around his wrists, David thought about his wife at home, probably wondering why he was taking so long. He thought about the sandwich he'd bought, now forgotten on the hood of his truck. He thought about tomorrow being his day off, and how he'd planned to work on the fence in his backyard. Most of all, he thought about the oath he'd taken when he first enlisted, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He'd always focused on that first part: foreign enemies, distant threats, battles fought on soil far from home. He'd never imagined that domestic enemies might wear badges. The back seat of the patrol car felt like a cage. David sat with his hands cuffed behind him, the metal cutting into his wrists every time the car hit a bump. The vinyl seats were cracked and worn, smelling of disinfectant and something else he couldn't quite identify. Through the thick plexiglass barrier, he could see Officer Thompson in the driver's seat, talking on his radio in low tones. David's mind was racing, but his military training kept him focused on the situation at hand. He needed to think clearly, not let anger or panic cloud his judgment. This was a problem that needed solving, and problems always had solutions if you approached them the right way. The first thing he noticed was that they weren't moving. The car was still parked in the convenience store lot, engine running, but going nowhere. Through the side window, he could see the other patrol cars still there, their lights now turned off. The officers were standing around talking, but David couldn't hear what they were saying. His phone was still in his pocket. They'd taken his wallet and keys, but somehow they'd missed his phone during the search. Maybe they figured he couldn't use it with his hands cuffed behind his back. They were probably right about that, but David was starting to form an idea. "Officer Thompson," David called out, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "I need to make a phone call." Thompson glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You'll get your phone call at the station." "Sir, I understand that's the normal procedure," David said, choosing his words carefully. "But I'm requesting to contact my commanding officer. Under military regulations, I'm required to notify my chain of command if I'm detained by civilian authorities." This wasn't entirely true, but it sounded official enough that Thompson might buy it. David was gambling that the officer's knowledge of military protocol was limited, and that the mention of regulations might make him think twice. Thompson turned around in his seat, studying David's face. "Your commanding officer?" "Yes, sir." "Colonel Patricia Hayes. She's my unit commander. Military personnel are supposed to report any civilian law enforcement contact to their superiors immediately." David could see Thompson considering this. The officer was probably thinking about potential complications, about military officials asking questions he might not want to answer. "Good. Let him worry about that." "I don't know," Thompson said slowly. "We're processing you for arrest. Standard procedure says you wait until we get to the station." "Officer Thompson," David said, putting on his most professional military voice. "With respect, this situation involves a member of the armed forces. The military takes these things very seriously. If you don't allow me to make this call, and my commanding officer finds out I was detained without proper notification, there could be serious consequences." This was pure bluff, But David was counting on Thompson's uncertainty about military procedures. Most civilian law enforcement officers had limited interaction with military personnel, and they often assumed that military regulations were more complex and binding than they actually were. Martinez appeared at the passenger side window, tapping on the glass. Thompson rolled it down. "What's he saying?" Martinez asked. "He wants to call his commanding officer. Says it's some kind of military rule." Martinez looked back at David, then at Thompson. "You think that's real?" "I don't know," Thompson admitted. "But if it is and we don't let him make the call, we could have the army breathing down our necks." David stayed quiet, letting them talk it over. Sometimes the best strategy was to let people convince themselves to do what you wanted them to do. "Look," Thompson said finally, "I'll let you make the call, but you try anything funny and it's over. Understood?" "Understood, sir. I just need to contact Colonel Hayes." Thompson got out of the car and opened the back door. "I'm going to uncuff one hand so you can use your phone, but I'm staying right here, and if you try to run or do anything stupid, you'll regret it." David nodded. The handcuff came off his right wrist and the relief was immediate. His hand was numb from the restricted circulation, but he could still use his fingers. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Colonel Patricia Hayes answered on the second ring. "This is Colonel Hayes." "Colonel, this is Staff Sergeant David Johnson from the 425th Reserve Unit. Ma'am, I need to report that I'm currently being detained by civilians, police officers." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Detained? For what?" "Ma'am, I'm not entirely sure. I was purchasing food while in uniform, and officers approached me claiming suspicious activity. They've placed me under arrest despite my providing military identification." David could hear the change in Colonel Hayes' voice immediately. "Where are you right now, Sergeant?" "Quick Stop convenience store on Maple Street, ma'am. I'm in the back of a patrol car." "And you're in uniform?" "Yes, ma'am. Full-duty uniform with all proper insignia and identification." Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment, and David could almost hear her mind working. He knew she was the kind of officer who didn't tolerate nonsense, who would go to bat for her soldiers when they were being treated unfairly. "Sergeant Johnson, I want you to stay calm and comply with whatever the officers tell you. Don't give them any reason to escalate this situation. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'm going to make some calls. What's the name of the officer in charge there?" David looked at Thompson, who was listening to every word. "Officer Thompson is the primary contact, ma'am." "Put him on the phone." David held out the phone to Thompson. "Sir, my colonel would like to speak with you." Thompson took the phone reluctantly. "This is Officer Thompson." David couldn't hear Colonel Hayes' side of the conversation, but he could see the effect it was having on Thompson. The officer's expression changed from confident to uncertain to worried in the span of about 30 seconds. "Yes, ma'am," Thompson said. "I understand, yes, we have his military ID. No, ma'am, there wasn't any real incident. Just a report of suspicious activity." Another pause. "Yes, ma'am, I'll hold." Thompson looked at David, then at Martinez, who had been watching the whole exchange. "She's calling the police chief," Thompson said quietly. David felt a small surge of hope. Colonel Hayes wasn't just any officer. She was connected, respected, and she knew how to work the system. More importantly, she was exactly where David had hoped she would be. "Sergeant," Thompson said, handing the phone back to David, "your colonel wants to talk to you again." David took the phone. "Yes, ma'am?" "Sergeant Johnson, I want you to know that I'm currently at City Hall with Chief Morrison and several other city officials. We're in a community relations meeting. I've just informed the chief about your situation, and he's very concerned about what's happening." David's heart started beating faster. Colonel Hayes wasn't just at any meeting. She was at a meeting with the police chief. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. "Ma'am, I appreciate your assistance with this matter. Sergeant, this is not your fault. You did nothing wrong, and this situation is completely unacceptable. I want you to know that Chief Morrison is on his way to your location right now, and he's not happy about what he's hearing." David could see Thompson and Martinez talking urgently to each other. Thompson was back on his radio, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. Whatever was being said on the other end wasn't making him happy. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Sergeant, I'm also going to be making some other calls. This incident is going to be investigated thoroughly, and I want you to know that you have the full support of your command. When David hung up the phone, he could see that everything had changed. Thompson was pacing back and forth, no longer the confident officer who had treated David like a criminal. Martinez was standing by their patrol car, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The other officers who had responded as backup were starting to look confused. They'd been called to assist with the arrest of a suspicious person, but now they were hearing terms like military command and police chief and investigation. David sat back in the patrol car, his right hand still free, and allowed himself a small smile. One phone call. That's all it had taken. Not to a lawyer, not to his family, but to the one person who had the connections and authority to make things happen quickly. Colonel Hayes had been in the right place at the right time, and she'd just turned David's worst evening into what might become the officer's worst career decision. In the distance, David could see more headlights approaching. Big, official-looking vehicles that definitely weren't regular patrol cars. The cavalry was coming, and it was being led by people who had the power to make real changes. Thompson walked back to the patrol car, his face pale. Sergeant, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Am I still under arrest, officer? Thompson hesitated. That's being reviewed right now. David nodded. The handcuff came off his left wrist, and he stepped out of the car, straightening his uniform and standing at attention. His military bearing was perfect, professional, and completely at odds with how he'd been treated for the past hour. As the first official vehicle pulled into the parking lot, David knew that this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first official vehicle to arrive wasn't a police car. It was a black SUV with government plates, and David recognized it immediately as the type of vehicle used by high-ranking military officers. Colonel Hayes stepped out of the passenger side before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, her uniform crisp and her expression thunderous. Behind her came a man in a business suit who David didn't recognize, but his authoritative manner and the way the arriving police officers straightened up when they saw him suggested he was someone important. A third person emerged from the driver's seat, a woman with a press badge hanging from her neck and a camera in her hand. Officer Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. The confident, aggressive demeanor he'd shown earlier was completely gone, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew they were in serious trouble. Martinez wasn't much better, standing by their patrol car and shifting his weight from foot to foot like a child who'd been caught breaking something valuable. Colonel Hayes walked directly to David, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, checking for any signs of injury or mistreatment. Sergeant Johnson, are you hurt? No, ma'am, I'm fine, David replied, standing at attention. Good. She turned to face Thompson, and her voice could have cut through steel. Officer Thompson, I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the 425th Reserve Unit. I want you to explain to me exactly why one of my soldiers was handcuffed and detained while in uniform. Thompson cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity in the area. We were just following standard procedure. Standard procedure? The man in the business suit stepped forward. I'm Chief Morrison. Officer Thompson, what exactly was suspicious about a uniformed service member buying a sandwich? David watched as Thompson's face went through several shades of red. The chief's arrival had clearly caught him off guard, and now he was trying to justify actions that sounded more ridiculous with each passing minute. Sir, we had a report from a concerned citizen about unusual behavior in the parking lot, Thompson said, his voice getting smaller. Chief Morrison pulled out his phone. I've been listening to the radio traffic from this incident. There was no call about suspicious activity. The only call logged was your request for backup after you'd already detained Sergeant Johnson. The silence that followed was deafening. David could see the other officers who had responded as backup exchanging worried glances. They were starting to realize that they'd been called to assist with something that should never have happened in the first place. Furthermore, Chief Morrison continued, I've just reviewed the body camera footage from this incident. David's heart jumped. Body cameras. He'd forgotten that most patrol officers wore them now, recording everything that happened during their shifts. If there was video evidence of how he'd been treated, then there would be no way for Thompson and Martinez to spin the story in their favor. The footage shows Sergeant Johnson behaving respectfully and cooperatively throughout this entire encounter, the chief said, his voice growing colder. It also shows him providing proper military identification, which you dismissed without proper examination. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but Chief Morrison held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished. The footage also captures audio of you referring to his uniform as a costume and suggesting that his military identification was fake, despite clear evidence to the contrary. David felt a surge of vindication. Everything he'd experienced, all the disrespect and humiliation, had been recorded. There would be no denying what had happened, no way to twist the narrative to make him look like the problem. The woman with the press badge had been taking photos and notes throughout the conversation. David realized that this wasn't just an official response. This was going to be news. The story of what had happened here would be public knowledge, which meant accountability was more likely. Colonel Hayes stepped closer to Thompson. Officer, do you understand what you've done here? You've detained a veteran, a man who has served his country with honor, and treated him like a criminal for the act of existing while in uniform. Ma'am, I was just doing my job, Thompson protested weakly. No, Colonel Hayes replied sharply. Your job is to serve and protect the community. Sergeant Johnson is part of that community. He spent years serving and protecting this country, including you and your family. And this is how you treat him? Chief Morrison was speaking quietly into his phone, but David could hear fragments of the conversation. Words like internal affairs and immediate investigation and administrative leave drifted over to where they were standing. Martinez, who had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. Chief, maybe we can work this out. It was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? The reporter stepped forward, her voice sharp with professional interest. Officer, are you saying that detaining a uniformed service member without cause is just a misunderstanding? Martinez realized his mistake immediately. By trying to minimize what had happened, he'd actually made it worse. Now it looked like the officers didn't even understand the seriousness of their actions. Chief Morrison finished his phone call and addressed the gathered officers. Officers Thompson and Martinez, you are both suspended from duty effective immediately pending a full investigation. You will surrender your weapons and badges to Sergeant Phillips. David watched as the two officers who had treated him like a criminal just an hour ago were now facing the end of their careers. Thompson's face was pale as he unclipped his badge and handed it over. Martinez looked like he might be sick. Chief Morrison, Colonel Hayes said, I want to make sure you understand that this isn't just about tonight. This is about a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. What do you mean, Colonel? I've already made some calls. Officer Thompson has 3 previous complaints filed against him for racial profiling that were never properly investigated. Officer Martinez has 2 similar complaints that were dismissed without adequate review. The chief's expression darkened further. Are you telling me that my department has been aware of potential misconduct by these officers and failed to take appropriate action? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Chief, and that's exactly what's going to be investigated. David felt a mix of emotions watching this unfold. Relief that the truth was coming out, anger that it had taken this long, and satisfaction that there would finally be consequences for actions that should never have been tolerated. One of the other responding officers approached the chief quietly. David couldn't hear what was said, but he could see the chief's face, getting redder with each word. Colonel Hayes, Sergeant Johnson, the chief said after the officer walked away. I've just been informed that there's additional body camera footage from the other responding units. It appears that officers Thompson and Martinez made several inappropriate comments about Sergeant Johnson that were captured on video. The reporter's pen was moving quickly across her notepad. This story was getting bigger by the minute, and David realized that his ordeal was going to become a catalyst for something much larger than just his individual case. Sergeant Johnson, Chief Morrison addressed him directly. I want to personally apologize for what happened to you tonight. This is not representative of the values of our department, and I assure you that there will be consequences. Thank you, sir. David replied. "I appreciate that." But even as he accepted the apology, David knew that this was about more than just him. How many other people had been treated this way by these same officers? How many incidents had been covered up or dismissed? How many complaints had been ignored? Colonel Hayes seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "Chief Morrison, I think we need to have a broader conversation about training, accountability, and oversight in your department." "I agree completely, Colonel. This incident has exposed some serious problems that need to be addressed immediately." As the crowd in the parking lot began to disperse, David realized that his simple trip to buy a sandwich had turned into something much bigger. The phone call to Colonel Hayes hadn't just saved him from an unjust arrest. It had opened the door to real change. The reporter approached him as he was getting ready to leave. "Sergeant Johnson, would you be willing to speak about what happened here tonight?" David thought for a moment. Part of him just wanted to go home, hug his wife, and try to forget this whole experience. But another part of him knew that staying quiet wouldn't help the next person who found themselves in a similar situation. "Yes," he said finally. "I think people need to know what happened here." As David finally drove home that night, his sandwich long forgotten and cold, he reflected on how quickly everything had changed. One phone call had transformed him from a victim into a catalyst for change. Tomorrow, this story would be in the news. Next week, there would be investigations and hearings. Next month, there might be real reforms that would protect other people from experiencing what he had gone through. It wasn't the evening he'd planned, but maybe it was the evening that needed to happen. 3 weeks after the incident at the Quick Stop, David sat in a conference room at City Hall, watching Chief Morrison announce the results of the internal affairs investigation. The room was packed with reporters, city council members, and community activists who had been following the story since that first news report. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, partly because the evidence was so clear and partly because of the public pressure that had built up after the story went viral. The video footage from the body cameras had been released to the media, and millions of people had watched David being treated like a criminal for the simple act of buying a sandwich while wearing his Army uniform. The investigation has concluded that Officers Thompson and Martinez violated multiple departmental policies and engaged in conduct that was both unprofessional and discriminatory, Chief Morrison announced to the gathered crowd. Both officers have been terminated from the YE Police Department, effective immediately. David felt a complex mix of emotions hearing those words. Relief, certainly, but also sadness that it had come to this. He'd never wanted to destroy anyone's career. He'd just wanted to be treated with basic respect and dignity. But the investigation had revealed much more than just what happened that night. Thompson had a file full of complaints that stretched back 5 years. Citizens had accused him of excessive force, racial profiling, and filing false reports. Most of those complaints had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions that did nothing to change his behavior. Martinez's record wasn't much better. Though he had fewer complaints, the pattern was similar. Citizens reporting inappropriate stops, disrespectful treatment, and targeting based on appearance rather than actual suspicious behavior. The department had failed to connect the dots, treating each incident as isolated rather than part of a troubling pattern. Furthermore, Chief Morrison continued, the investigation revealed serious deficiencies in our complaint review process and supervisory oversight. As a result, I am announcing my resignation as Chief of Police effective at the end of this month. This announcement sent a murmur through the crowd. David hadn't expected this. Chief Morrison had seemed genuinely committed to making things right, but apparently the problems ran deeper than anyone had initially realized. The federal investigation had been even more revealing. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had gotten involved after Colonel Hayes made some calls to contacts in Washington. What they found was a department with a culture that protected bad officers and silenced victims. Detective Captain Wilson, who had been Thompson's supervisor, was found to have systematically buried complaints and discouraged citizens from filing reports. He'd been placed on administrative leave and was facing federal charges for civil rights violations. 2 other supervisors were also under investigation for their roles in covering up misconduct. But the consequences extended beyond just individual officers. The city had agreed to a consent decree with the Department of Justice, requiring comprehensive reforms in training, accountability, and oversight. Every officer in the department would have to undergo bias training and de-escalation training. A civilian oversight board would be established to review complaints independently. David had been invited to speak at today's press conference, and as Chief Morrison finished his remarks, he found himself walking to the podium. The room fell, quiet as he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled crowd. 3 weeks ago, I stopped at a convenience store to buy a sandwich, David began, his voice steady and clear. I was wearing my Army uniform just like I am today. I had served my country for 12 years, including 2 deployments overseas. I thought that meant something. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I learned that night that for some people, my service didn't matter. My uniform didn't matter. My respectful behavior didn't matter. What mattered was their assumptions about who I was based on what I looked like. The room was completely silent. David could see people taking notes, cameras recording every word. But I also learned something else that night. I learned that there are people who will stand up for what's right. Colonel Hayes could have brushed off my phone call, told me to handle it through normal channels. Instead, she dropped everything and came to help one of her soldiers. Chief Morrison could have defended his officers and covered up what happened. Instead, he demanded accountability. David looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. The reporter who covered this story could have written a simple article and moved on. Instead, she dug deeper and found the pattern of abuse that had been hidden for years. The citizens who called for justice could have stayed silent. Instead, they demanded change. He took a breath before continuing. What happened to me that night was wrong, but what's happened since then gives me hope. Real change is hard, and it's slow, but it's happening. Officers Thompson and Martinez lost their jobs not just because of what they did to me, but because this community finally said enough is enough. The questions from reporters came quickly after David finished speaking. How did he feel about the officers being fired? Was he satisfied with the changes being implemented? Would he consider legal action against the city? David answered each question thoughtfully. Yes, he believed the terminations were appropriate. The officers had violated their oath to serve and protect, and there had to be consequences for that. The reforms being implemented were a good start, but the real test would be whether they actually changed the culture of the department. As for legal action, David had decided against pursuing a lawsuit. My goal was never to get rich off this experience, he explained. My goal was to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The changes being implemented are worth more to me than any financial settlement. After the press conference, David met privately with Mayor Rodriguez and the incoming interim police chief. They wanted his input on the new training programs being developed and the selection process for the Civilian Oversight Board. Sergeant Johnson, the mayor said, I know this has been a difficult experience for you and your family, but I want you to know that your courage in speaking out has made a real difference. David nodded. It had been difficult. The media attention had been overwhelming at times. His wife had been worried about his safety, especially after some people on social media had criticized him for making trouble for the police. But he'd also received hundreds of messages of support from veterans, community members, and people who had experienced similar treatment. One message that particularly touched him had come from a young man named Anthony, who wrote to say that David's story had given him the courage to file a complaint about his own treatment by police. I thought no one would believe me, Anthony had written. But seeing what happened with your case made me realize that speaking up can make a difference. That letter reminded David why all of this had been worth it. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating a system where everyone could expect to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their background, or their appearance. 6 months later, David was invited to speak at the police academy's graduation ceremony. Standing before a class of new officers, he told them about that night at the Quick Stop and the lessons he'd learned. Your badge gives you authority, he told them, but it also gives you responsibility. The uniform you wear should protect and serve everyone in this community, not just the people who look like you or think like you. He looked out at the young faces in the audience, hoping his words would stick with them when they faced their own difficult moments on the street. Remember that every person you encounter is someone's son or daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone's parent or child. They deserve to be treated with the same respect you'd want for your own family members. After the ceremony, several of the new officers approached David to thank him for his remarks. One young officer, fresh out of the academy, shook his hand and said, "Sergeant, I promise you that I'll remember what you said out there. I'll be better than the officers who stopped you that night." David smiled and patted the young man on the shoulder. "I believe you will be, and that's how we make sure this never happens again." As David drove home that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since that night when he just wanted to buy a sandwich. 2 officers had lost their careers. A police chief had resigned. An entire department was being reformed. Federal investigators were still working to uncover the full extent of the problems that had been hidden for years. But more importantly, conversations were happening. Training was being improved. Policies were being rewritten. And young officers were being taught that their job was to serve everyone, not just some people. It had all started with one phone call, one moment of courage, one person refusing to accept that what was happening to him was acceptable. David had learned that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, that standing up for what's right could create ripples of change that extended far beyond any single incident. His uniform had been dismissed as a costume that night, but in the end, it had represented something much more powerful than the officers who had disrespected it could have imagined. It had represented service, sacrifice,